Okay, so now we are still in Matthew 16, and we discussed last week that flesh and blood revealed it to Peter, as in Andrew brought Simon to Jesus in chapter 1 of John. Andrew introduced Jesus as the Messiah, but the full conviction of the Messiah in Peter's mind came from God, the Father. And then we already saw in chapter 16 verse 18 that you are Peter, as in the name Peter is given by Jesus Christ in chapter 1 of John, much before Peter understood who Jesus is. And Jesus was giving Peter a preview of how he would be used in the expansion of God's kingdom. Okay, now the stone, which would be a foundation for the church. Okay, if you read Ephesians 2 verse 20, apostles and prophets are the foundation of the church, and Christ is the cornerstone. So, on the basis of the confession that Peter gave about Christ from the Father, okay, the conviction that Peter gave about Christ is from the Father, and based on that confession, Jesus will build his church. So the church this is not about Peter actually. If Peter understood it, it is because the Father enabled him to understand. Because a lot of Catholics make this passage about Peter. This passage is not about Peter. It's about Christ building his church, and the gates of hell will not being able to prevail against it. Or death has no authority over what Jesus will build. Okay, death has no authority over what Jesus will build, because Jesus, through his death and resurrection, will defeat sin and death and Satan. Alright, so death has no authority over what Jesus will do regarding his church. Now, if you look at centuries, the last 21 centuries, many attempts have been made to defeat or remove God's church. But none of those things have happened. God has preserved his church, so hell cannot defeat the purposes of God. Alright, now, the next verse, in verse 19, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and I have already told you what that means. If you look at Acts chapter 1 to 12, the major character in those 12 chapters is Peter, the leader of the apostles. And he is the major speaker, in most of these places, as in the day of Pentecost, and when they heal a man who was lame from birth, and then when they are arrested, and then in Ananias being caught, and then in chapter 8, where Peter and John go to Samaria and the recognition of the ministry happens there. Then in chapter 10, Cornelius, Peter goes and preaches to Cornelius. So in Jewish, Samaritan and Gentile areas, the gospel of God's kingdom started off with Peter's ministry. That is the key being referred to in here. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Not, as I said last time, it's not that Peter will be the gatekeeper in the heaven and he will allow people or he will stop people. That's not the idea here. Okay. Now, verse 19. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now, many of our translations have this in it, right? And this is a misleading translation. See, according to verse 19 in our Bibles, this is how this verse looks like. Whatever you decide on earth, God will say, okay. Or whatever you say no to, God decides, okay. That's not how you should understand this. In the Greek, it's like this: whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. Meaning, whatever you do on earth is a result of what has happened there. Whatever you say yes to here is a result of what has happened there. Or whatever you say no to is a result of what has happened there. So the decisions are made there and applied here. It's not the other way around. We look at verse 19 and say, decisions are made here, and God says, okay. No, no. God makes decisions and we say, okay. Understood? So if you want to make me give an example on this, imagine, okay, now I was born in Dubai, okay, and I was born to Indian parents, and my parents had Indian passports. So my parents were born in India. They had their Indian passports when they went to UAE, and I was born there. So I am born to Indian parents. So what citizenship should I get? Even though I am born in UAE, an Indian passport. So the Indian government is not there in UAE, but the Indian government has put or opened a consulate. Okay, you have an Indian ambassador there. Okay, so the Indian government has appointed the Indian consulate there so that the consulate will take care of the Indian citizens in UAE. So if somebody is born in UAE, the Indian citizenship is given by the Indian consulate. Okay. Now the Indian consulate doesn't decide whom to give Indian citizenship to. The decision is made by the government of India, which the Indian consulate gives on the basis of that decision. So the government of India here makes the decisions for citizenship. The Indian consulate in Dubai gives citizenship to a child in UAE based on the guidelines that the government of India here gives. Did you understand? No. All right. See, now there is the Indian government in here. Is the Indian government there in UAE? No. What happens if an Indian couple's child is born in UAE? That child needs a nationality. That is an Indian nationality. Now, who gives the Indian nationality? The Indian government, but it can't give directly. To take the child out from the country, you need a passport. Understood? So, that child needs an Indian passport, and who gives that passport? The government. But how can the government give it? The government of India has consulates or embassy. Have you heard the word embassy? Embassy, ambassador. Yeah. So the Indian government has an ambassador in UAE, and the Indian government has a consulate in UAE, and that consulate. So any Indian child born, the application has to be filed in the consulate. Okay, and based on that application, the consulate, on the guidelines of the Indian government here, gives the citizenship to the child. Understood? So I got my citizenship by not being born in India. I was not born in India. I was born there, but I got my citizenship of India from the Indian consulate there. So the Indian consulate in UAE functions on the guidelines of the government of India here. The same way, Peter doesn't make decisions. Okay, he applies the decisions that are made there. So who decides who is a Christian? Peter? No. God recognizes who is in Christ or who is not in Christ. God recognizes who are his and who is not his. What is Peter doing? He preaches that, and based on that, people receive or reject. So those who receive, they hear Peter's message. So this is what it means here. The disciples. Now this word, chapter 16 verse 19, is told about the disciples also in chapter 18 verse 18. Okay. This is told about the entire disciples. So it's not Peter's job only. Peter and the rest of the disciples have the responsibility to put into practice or apply whatever is decided up there. Understood? That is what we need to understand. So once the disciples understood that Jesus was the Messiah, Jesus ordered his disciples not to tell anyone. Why? Because the people were expecting a political Messiah. Okay? They wanted a freedom from the Romans, and they thought one would come like that. But Jesus didn't come to free them from the Romans now. Now he came to give them freedom from the spiritual slavery, from the slavery of sin, so that they would hunger and thirst after righteousness, so that they would come out of the poverty of spirit. Okay? Now, from that time, now once they understood that Jesus is the Messiah, from now on, Jesus tells them what is the Messiah going to do. Verse 21. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things at the hands of the elders and chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. So the Israelites and especially the disciples, they were looking for a king who would kill. Jesus says, I am the Messiah and I am going to be killed. I am going to be ill-treated by the chief priests. The Jews won't love me, they will hate me. I will be killed and I will be raised on the third day. He started to tell them this. And then, Peter took him aside. Come here, now I want to say something to you. I want to say some small secret. Come. And began to rebuke Jesus. Began to rebuke Jesus, saying, Never, Lord. That's quite an absurd way. What does the word Lord mean? He's calling Jesus Lord and he's telling Jesus what to do. If Jesus is Lord, Jesus should be telling something and Peter should be listening. Only then that word Lord makes sense. But he is calling Jesus Lord and telling him, No, no, no. No, Lord. Understood? This shall never happen to you. What? Death shall never happen to you. No one wanted Jesus to die. None of these disciples wanted Jesus to die. Okay? But Jesus says, I'm going to die. I've come for that. And when Peter said, No, Lord, that has not happened to you. Now, Peter, see, since he understood that Jesus is the Messiah, now he thought he can decide what the Messiah should do. Okay? That's what happens. Suddenly when you are successful in something, you think you have owned the world. Everything is now under your control, and you think you can dictate terms. You can decide how things should happen. But what did Jesus turn and say to Peter? Get behind me, Satan. Okay? The very same Peter of whom Jesus said, Blessed are you, son of Jonah, Simon, son of Jonah. The Father in heaven revealed this to you. To that same person, Jesus is calling Satan. Why is he calling Satan? Why is he calling Peter Satan? Because Peter is trying to get Jesus avoid death. Peter is doing it out of his love. Okay? He's doing it out of his love. But behind Peter, who operates? Satan. What did Satan try to do in the temptation, the third temptation, where the whole world and its glory, the kingdoms and its glory are offered to Jesus? All this I will give you. Just bow down and worship me. Okay? What did Jesus say? You shall only worship the Lord your God, and only Him you shall serve. So, you should understand one thing. Jesus, being the Messiah, the Son of David, has access to all the kingdoms of the world and its power. And when will he get that? On the day he is enthroned as king. On the day it's not enough for him to be born as the king. He needs to sit on the throne, right? That day he will receive authority. And when is that day? The day he is resurrected. The day he is resurrected, that is when he will be considered as king, enthroned as king. And after he is enthroned as king, he will get all of these worldly kingdoms and its authority. Which means that it's only after his resurrection that he will get this authority of the world. And for resurrection to happen, what should happen? To raise back from the dead, what should happen first? For Jesus to come back from the dead, what must happen? For Jesus to come back from the dead, what must happen first? Death. He must die. Only if he dies can he resurrect, right? Yeah. So what happens at death? By Jesus' death, he will defeat Satan, sin, and death. Satan knows that. How? Because God said to the serpent in the book of Genesis, the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent, and you will bruise his heel. So it's in the death of it's in Jesus' death that the defeat of Satan happens. So when the death of Jesus on the cross happens, Satan is defeated. Understood? So for resurrection to happen, death must happen. And when death happens, sin, Satan, and death is defeated. And what did Satan try to say to Jesus? All these things I'll give you. Just bow down and worship me. Don't die. You don't have to die to get all of these things. Just bow down. This is simple, right? Because Satan knows that if he is going to die, Satan will be defeated. That is why Satan tried that. But it didn't work out that time. Okay? So do you think Satan stopped his work? No. See, look at Luke chapter 4 and verse 13. Luke 4 verse 13. When the devil had finished all his tempting, he left him until and until when? Until the verse 13. Opportune time. Like the devil left Jesus now, but he will come back when the time is right. See, here the devil is talking directly to him, and now the devil is talking through Peter. See, he's talking through a friend of Jesus. Suppose an enemy says something to me, I will say no. But when that same thing is said through a friend, what happens? I might say yes. Got me? That is the opportune time which Luke was referring to. And that is when Satan is working through Peter. Peter doesn't know that. But Jesus, who is so focused upon what he came to do, sees the slight effort from Satan from this far. He is so focused on that anything that disturbs that focus, Jesus can sense it so quickly. Understood? Suppose you are training for playing cricket and you want to stay fit. So what would you do is you will avoid anything that has got sugar in it. Anything that has got heavy calories in that, you will avoid, just so that your body becomes fit. And so what happens when you are passing by KFC, or when you pass by anything that is heavy in food, calories, you don't want to go there. And even if your friend offers it to you, you say, no, I'm not having it now. I'll have something else. See, when you look at it and when somebody offers it to you, your reaction to both should be the same. A vehement reaction. That's what has happened here. When the temptation came in its full force here, earlier, Jesus said no. When the temptation comes through a friend, Jesus again says no. He calls Peter Satan. Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You don't have the mind. You don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Okay, merely human concerns. You're only thinking about what man thinks. You're not thinking about what God thinks. God requires that I die. You're only looking at what man thinks. I don't want to look at that. And then this is a disciplining for Peter. If he thought he can decide what the Messiah should do, Jesus says, you don't decide what the Messiah should do. You stay in your place. God decides. I'll decide what the Messiah should do. I'm the Messiah, right? I'll decide. Then Jesus said to them in verse 24 onwards. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. See, now these people know who Jesus is. Okay, now it's not just to this crowd that Jesus talks, because in Mark chapter 8, okay, 8 verse 27 to 33 we already finished. We discussed. So Matthew chapter 16 and verse 24 says Jesus talked to the disciples. But Mark 8 verse 34 says Jesus called the crowd to him along with his disciples. Okay, so now that the people know who Jesus is, there is so much of a responsibility, so much of a response coming on this. Okay, there's so much of a response coming on this, and the response is like this. Knowing that Jesus is the Messiah, now people will be attracted to him. Because he is the Messiah, right? He is the Messiah. He admits it. The disciples have started to recognize that. And now, when people want to follow him, Jesus doesn't say, oh, okay, all of you want to come. There are requirements for that. If anyone wants to follow Jesus because he is the Messiah, there are some things which have to be done. What is it? Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross and follow Jesus. What does it mean to deny themselves? तन्नतान त्यजिच्छ, अपने आप को इनकार करके. What does that mean? Yeah, as in not my will, but your will. As in deny oneself means to let go of the leadership that I have in my life and give the complete leadership to Jesus. If you want to follow Jesus, he needs to be the Lord of your life. You can't be your own master. You can't say no, Lord. Understood? You cannot be the ruler in this relationship. Jesus has to be. So you have to give the complete authority of your life to Jesus. Deny themselves means this. Take up their cross. Take up their cross. What does that mean? See, if Jesus is going to die, then the follower of Jesus must be willing to follow Jesus all the way till death. See, if you are a first century Jew, and if you saw anyone in the Jewish street with Roman soldiers and somebody carrying the cross, it means one thing: that person is going to die. There is no more life left for him in this world. He's going to die. Taking up the cross and following Jesus means to go in his leadership till death and to be hated by the world. So, to take up the cross in that time means to be hated by the world also. Because it's the worst criminal that uh, is crucified. The worst criminal is crucified. Understood? So, that thing is what Jesus says to him. I mean, you can't just leave when your life is threatened. Like, you can't just follow Christ when everything is good and reject Christ when everything is bad. You have to follow him till you die. That's the requirement. So, one thing, you have to uh, hand over the complete control of your life to Jesus. You have to follow Jesus all the way till your death and be ready to be hated by the world. And you have to follow Jesus in everything, what he says. I mean, there is no area where you decide something and the other area he decides. I mean, there is no division between in us regarding secular and sacred. Do you know what these two words mean? Secular and sacred? Do you know what the word sacred means? Sacred, holy, or for God. I mean, there is no area in my life where this part is for God and this part is for me. This part is for God, this part for the world. Everything is sacred. Everything is for God. Everything is for Jesus. He decides how I should talk. He decides how I should behave. He decides how I should think. He decides how I should approach human relationships, money, power, authority, anything. Anything and everything in life, he decides and I follow. Complete authority being submitted to him. If you are willing for that, follow Jesus, or else don't follow. Following Jesus means to love him more than anyone else also. Okay. Now, you might think, I mean, people might think, this is such a hard requirement. It's like you want to be healed from a disease, from diabetes, cut off all sugar. Oh, what a hard requirement. Some sugar here and there. I'll take more insulin, no problem. Some people do that. What people don't understand is if you don't take food as medicine, you will take medicine as food later on. If you don't eat properly now, food is medicine actually. If you don't eat food properly, then you will eat food as medicine. No, you will eat medicine as food. 3 times without food. Okay, doctor will give you medicine 3 times. Normally it's before food and after food, right? There will come a point where you will eat medicines without food. That's not what we want. I hope you understand. I understand the point that I'm trying to make. Following Jesus has got, you understand that he is the way, the truth, and the life. And following Jesus has got such heavy responsibilities on those who choose him. Now, one might think, what is the point of choosing him with such a big sacrifice? He is the Messiah, but what is it worth following him like this? Yeah. So, if somebody says, I will preserve my life by not following him. If I'm going to follow him, I'll lose my life. Somebody says that, Jesus says to them in verse 25, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. If somebody thinks, oh, following Jesus in this earth is going to be a loss of life for me, I'll safeguard my life. In the end, what happens? Whatever he tried to safeguard is lost because he can't keep his life, right? Even if he doesn't get killed by persecution, he will die one day. He can't keep his life. So, whatever he tried to save, it's gone. Whatever he forsook, that is also gone. He tried to forsake Christ and keep his life. In the end, he loses Christ and his life. But whoever loses their life for me will find life. If somebody follows Christ and if he is killed, in the end he gets Christ, and when Christ comes back, he will get back his life. You got me? Yeah. Verse 26. What good will it be for somebody to gain the whole world yet forfeit their own soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? See, what is the most valuable thing that somebody has, which money can't buy? Life, your own life. Now, if you want to follow Jesus, obviously you cannot love money. Jesus said that earlier in Matthew 6. You can't serve two masters. You can't serve both God and money. And in the pursuit of Jesus, in the pursuit of money, if you say, I will not follow Jesus, I will be better off with money. You may be the richest person in your area, but when you die, your money is not sufficient to bring that soul back into life. Because money can't resurrect a dead person. Money can give you a few things in life. Money can't resurrect you from the dead. And what happens if you gain the world? You get the world, people love you, you have so much of money and all that, but you end up in hell. What can you give in exchange for that? Nothing. Okay, now there is a guy, the rich young ruler, in Matthew chapter 19. 19 or 18? 19, 19, 19, that guy is, yeah. So this guy, he came so near to God, to Jesus, but then when he heard, sell all your possessions and follow me, he went away. Because his heart was on riches. He was exceedingly rich. So what happens? He came so near but went so far. Okay. Now, Jesus says, now there's something extra that Jesus says in Mark. So the parallel passage for this is also found in Luke as well. So I'll just take you to that passage. Luke's Gospel, chapter Luke's Gospel, chapter 9 and verse 26. So Mark and Luke have added something which Matthew hasn't written. Okay. So I'll just read that. If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in the Father's glory and of the holy angels. So if anyone wants to distance themselves from Christ in this sinful generation, this crowd, okay, this crowd, among this crowd, or in the Jewish area, or in the Jewish country right now, at the time of speaking this, the religious leaders have rejected Jesus. And Jesus calls them an evil and adulterous generation multiple times. And the leaders are hating Jesus. If somebody wants the praise of men, if somebody wants to be in the good books of men and hate Jesus just to be on the good books of man, then when Jesus comes in his Father's glory and in the presence of the angels, Jesus will be ashamed of them, which means that anyone who rejects Christ will be rejected by Christ. Anyone who rejects Christ will be rejected by Christ. Anyone who receives Christ will be received by Christ. So, imagine if there is somebody, due to pressure of their families or friends or whatever, they reject Christ and go. Do you think they'll end up in heaven? No, they won't. They will end up in hell. They will end up in hell and they will be lost forever, eternally. Because they love the praise of man more than the praise of Jesus. Okay. And then in verse 28 of Matthew 16, Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." This is 9 verse 1 of Mark and 9 verse 27 of Luke, and Matthew 16 verse 28. So the next scene that we are going to see is the transfiguration scene. Okay. Now, what does this mean? There are some who are standing here as in where? Among them right now, among the crowds and among the disciples, there are some who will not die until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And that doesn't mean that these guys will be living forever until Jesus comes back in a second coming. The immediate context is about Jesus coming. Jesus coming, or Jesus showing himself to the three disciples, Peter, James, and John. Okay. So 17 verse 1, Matthew says after 6 days. Okay. Whereas, okay, Mark also says 6 days. But Luke says in Luke 9 verse 28, 8 days. So Matthew and Mark say 6, Luke says 8. So how do you reconcile these two? How do you reconcile these two? Matthew and Mark say 6 days, Luke says 8 days. So how do you reconcile these two? See, Luke includes the 1 day to go up the mountain and 1 day to come down from the mountain. Understood? Okay. So, 6 days is there. So, the day Jesus talked about the discipleship and all of that, 6 days from then, the event started. Six days from there, the event started. But Luke includes the going up and the coming down. And then he talks about the event there. Did you understand? So that is how we see a difference of days. See, whether it's 6 or 8 doesn't matter. The event happened. And besides, Mark is writing from Peter. Matthew knows this. Okay, when does Matthew know this? The transfiguration. When did Matthew know this? Matthew is not an eyewitness to this event. This event. Matthew is not an eyewitness. So when did Matthew know this? Can you read Matthew? Can you read Mark chapter? Okay, Matthew chapter 9, 17 verse 9. Yeah. Yeah. Now, this is what we read in Mark 9, verse 9 also. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So these three kept this thing as a secret until Jesus resurrected from the dead. So it's only then that Matthew knows this. So this is how. So Luke writes this from Matthew and Mark. Luke interviews people who have seen this, and this is how he knows. All right. So he took them up a high mountain by themselves. Okay. So why did he take them there? Okay. He and the three disciples. That's it. But Luke says he went up to the mountain to pray. 9 verse 28. Luke 9 verse 28. Now, normally, in normal cases, when Jesus does something spectacular, before that, he prays. Before he selected the disciples, he prayed. Before he walked on water, he prayed. So that pattern, he's going to show himself truly. The disciples haven't seen this version of Jesus yet. His humanity is so perfect that no one could see the deity, the glory of Jesus properly. Okay? Now, the appearance of his. Now let's look at this. He went up to the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became bright as a flash of lightning. Or his clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. So his face shone like the sun. So his face and his clothes became so white that no one could actually see that. It was so glorious. Okay. Now, Matthew doesn't talk regarding the disciples sleeping. Mark doesn't say that as well. But you look at verse 32 of Luke. 32. 9 verse 32. Peter and his companions were very sleepy. But when they became fully awake, what happened? They saw something. See, at that time when Jesus' glorifying happened, Moses and Elijah came to talk with Jesus. And what were they talking about? Hi, how are you? How are you doing? Is that what happened? No. You see in verse 31 of Matthew, of chapter 9 of Luke, they spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment in Jerusalem. They were talking about the death that Jesus would die. See, Jesus told about the death to his disciples, right? Earlier. And Simon said, no, let it not happen to you. But Jesus was again reminded of that fact while he was in the mountain. And the presence of Moses and Elijah. It talks about um, the law and the prophets. See, the law came through Moses. And Elijah is a representative of the prophets of the Old Testament. And the prophecies of the Old Testament also talk about the death of Christ. Isaiah 53, right? And many such verses in the Old Testament does talk about the death of Christ. So Moses and the prophets, they have all been represented by Moses and Elijah here as they're talking to Jesus about the death. And Peter and the other two guys, James and John, they saw this conversation happen. And for them, it was such a spectacular scene because they hadn't expected such a scene to happen. So we will talk about this later.